9/11. Talk about 9/11 on Staten Island. What happened? You were there, right?
Well, I was at West Point.
Oh, you were. That's right. That's right.
Yeah, but it was real. I mean, it was like very visceral. Okay, so I had gone to West Point on July 2nd, 2001 to start basic training, which was
Wow.
5 days after I graduated high school. Because, in New York, you graduate later than like in the Midwest. And so I had like 5 days to like just get all my alcohol and like women in. And then I went to basic training while everyone else is like partying before they start college or prison or whatever is in their future. And so I had very different expectations about what the Army meant, right? So to me, the Army meant like tough training, maybe a bit in Kosovo, take some cool pictures, and I'm not going to die. There's not going to be a real war. We don't do fight those anymore since Vietnam. Like
Right.
Persian Gulf War was a video game. Our casualties were so low. So that was the expectation, right? And I'll get to travel to Germany and take cool pictures. I'm up there. I just finished basic training. My two uncles, several cousins are all still firefighters. My mom's still in Staten Island. They all still are. And then 9/11 hits, and I'm in boxing class, right? Mandatory freshman plebes, we call us, boxing. It's like got to be, I think West Point and maybe the Naval Academy have to be the only institutions with mandatory boxing. So I was in there, and, we would warm up. We would shadow box in the mirrors the first 5 minutes. Like it was like the thing. And someone ran in. It was a morning class and said, something's going on with the World Trade Center. It's on fire or whatever. So very rare thing to break discipline. And the instructor let us run across the hallway into like the workout, like fitness cardio area. And we watched for like the rest, like the 45 minutes. And I watched the second plane hit in real time, which was bizarre. I'm in my boxing uniform at the military academy. And there was definitely this feel of something changed. That's not me reading back. I know we have a tendency to do that. At the moment, I and all of us who talked about it felt like, okay, the world did really just change for us in the sense that there's going to be a war probably. And my reflex to that was very similar to like the nation's reflex and Bush's, but without going there, I think we knew this is a war. Now, what added interest to me in particular was, when the buildings come down and it's clear that it's not just going to be the people in the planes and the floor that got hit that are going to die, but when the buildings start collapsing, I definitely had the feeling of Steven and Chris are either both dead, one of them's dead, who knows, like where is my family, right? So that was, and we didn't hear from them because all the cell phone service and stuff went out. And so like when I got back to my room, calling my mom and stuff, because like class was like kind of pushed off, and I was able to I was calling my mom and she's giving me updates. We haven't heard from Steven. We haven't heard from all our whole family. And my dad worked across Church Street. He worked for the state disability office. He was just like a case analyst. He kind of like did paperwork for them. And so he worked across the street, and I didn't hear from him. And so when the building came down, I don't think I understood how much damage was done so I was thinking about him too. It was really bizarre. He got out on the last ferry. He left early enough, and for a number of reasons, my uncles weren't there when the towers came down, and so they both lived, and they dug in the rubble for weeks. And my uncle's best friend, who was kind of almost like family, he was always, Marty Egan, captain, he died. Steve, they found his body because one of the rare ones. He was outside the building, so they found him pretty intact. But yeah, the output in Staten Island in particular was that per capita it had the most deaths. Per capita it had the most firefighter and cop deaths, of course, which is just because we have the most per capita. My mom went to she would have 35 or 40 funerals over the course of those months because they were spread out whenever they'd find like a bone or something, or the family would decide to have it despite no body. My mom was like a professional wake and funeral goer. And then they started naming the streets in my neighborhood and others after these folks, a lot of firemen who'd been killed. And I knew a lot of them. It was just like the whole place pivoted on that moment. And there was like a victim complex, and I don't mean that in a bad way, just like we felt like they became so pro-war because of it largely. And I understand why.
Right. All the flags went up. It was, I call it America's fascist moment. And it was not just in Staten Island. It was in Park Slope. I was in Park Slope right across right across the Verrazano Bridge there on 9/11. And there were no American flags in that bougie, liberal, upscale neighborhood on September 10th. And on September 12th, there was an American flag on every single stoop. And for many weeks, it was like that. And not only that, but all these liberal Democrat types who previously hated people like Giuliani and George Bush were talking about how great Giuliani and George Bush were, and that they were so glad that they were being protected by those two men. I mean, I'm not kidding you. That was like the common thing among like people now who would think that Trump is Hitler, you know, that demographic. They were applauding and loving the sort of father figures of Rudy Giuliani and George Bush at that moment. So, all right. So for you, though, when you saw that happening, you're at West Point. You clearly had a commitment and a strong interest in the military. You didn't believe you were going to be at war when you entered West Point, but you couldn't have been so naive that you didn't think it was a possibility, right?
Yeah.
And so when you saw the plane hit, it couldn't have been like, you know, oh my God, I wasn't supposed to go to war. But what were the feelings in your mind? I can tell you the feelings were in my mind. Mostly fear, because I was taking the subway every day at that point, all the way from Brooklyn to the top of Manhattan, right underneath the Trade Center. I thought everybody thought Al Qaeda was going to blow up the subway. Remember that? That was the thing. Sure. Everybody was talking about that, and I was terrified of that. Quite a bit of fear, quite a bit of apprehension, knowing that we were most likely going to go to war. I was very anti-war at that point. Had been my whole life, actually, as a political person. But I have to say that on September 11th, that afternoon, my wife was 8 months pregnant with my son. And it was, I would say, let's see, let's be honest here. I would say for about 12 hours, I wanted something like a Green Beret operation to go in and kill some people. Justin Raimondo, as far as I know, to this day, I think, as far as I know, who was the editor of antiwar.com, which you write for, as far as I know, he's the only person on the planet who published an article the very next day on September 12th saying what we all now think, which is this is blowback, and if we go to war, it will only be worse, and it could end up in an endless war. Justin was totally right. It's one of the most brilliant pieces of journalism. Justin died, by the way, this last year, and was a very difficult human being. But like a lot of people, I loved him and hated him kind of in equal measure, but he was certainly the only one. So anyway, sorry to that little digression, but I always think back on that moment as being when America really was fascist, because everybody for a moment there, even these liberals who never thought about the nation state, suddenly merged their identity with the nation state and had American flags and everything. And it scared me. So after about 6 or 12 hours of having Green Beret fantasies, you know, of going in and chopping off bin Laden's head or whatever, I got over it and started to see exactly what it was. And I saw all these intellectuals, these liberal intellectuals making arguments for the war, yada, yada. Anyway, back to you. So what was in so I had a little vengeance. Did you have a little vengeance in your heart then? Do you want to kill you some Arabs is what I'm getting at.
I hate this story. It's like this is the least favorite thing to say about myself. Like, I would like to go back in time. I want to jump in the DeLorean and have a fist fight with I was 18. I mean, I turned 18 in the Army. My mom had to sign me in because I was still 17. And you can join the Army and go on active duty at 17 if your mother signs you in or your guardian. Mm-hmm. So that's not an excuse, but
it is.
My response was secret. You didn't say this out loud even at West Point, because it was like that would have been considered like a tool bag thing, but like my secret feeling was that I was like excited that I was going to get to go to war and like show how special and masculine I was. I was going to put this new like nascent training to use. I mean, the adulation that would come my way. I mean, this was like, we were going to respond in Pearl Harbor. We were going to be our grandparents, who we always felt we could never measure up to, who had all been in World War II, who we all secretly knew were like better than us somehow because they were the greatest generation. Mm-hmm. I mean, a lot of that was going on at that moment and for probably that first couple of years. In fact, on St. Patrick's Day 2003, I was I was a sophomore at West Point, and I was in Manhattan, you know, in like Irish bars with my uncles, just getting bombed, you know, underage. There was like no drinking age in Manhattan after 9/11. You show a military ID, like you're not only getting in the bar, like you're not paying for drinks. You wear an Army shirt.
Right.
I mean, everything. I mean, women, the whole deal. It was like ridiculous. But the point is, so here I am, I'm like loaded with my like uncles just being a nut job and like dancing to cheesy frat boy music. And like, there's stuff on TV about this. The war is about to start, you know. The bombing is about to start of Iraq now. So nothing to do with 9/11. And my biggest fear, even then, was I'm going to miss this war because I'm not even a junior yet. And it's going to be just like the Persian Gulf War. It's going to be over in 100 hours, maybe 100 days, and I'll miss it. And all the guys who graduated in 2002 and maybe 2003 are going to get that fancy combat patch on the right shoulder. So the insider baseball, a little bit on the military, is the unit that you're in. You wear the patch on your left shoulder. Your right shoulder has an American flag. And if you've been to combat at any point in your career, for the rest of your career, you get to wear the patch of the unit you went to combat with. It's called a right shoulder patch or a combat patch. Ooh. So important is this in the military culture that even to this day, if you meet another soldier in uniform, we call it like the check. People will like look, and because it's a credibility check. Have you been in war? Mm-hmm. So that was really important then, because when I was at West Point, my instructors hadn't even been in war. Very few of them. A couple of them were old enough that they were in Gulf War, so they had a combat patch. But I'd say 10 to 15% of our teachers, majors, and captains in the Army had combat patches. And so if you did, you were God. And then now 9/11 happens, and everyone's going to have one. And your biggest fear is this will end, and I'll be that new lieutenant who doesn't have a patch, but all my soldiers do. That's how small thinking it was.
It's all about the combat patch.
It was really important. It still is. It really is. And it's getting important again because my generation, everyone had one, so it was no big deal. But now that we've like downgraded the wars, so it's like mostly special forces who are deploying.
Right. Like
the regular guys who graduated West Point 3 years ago, like they might not have it, and so they feel insecure, or a lot of them do. That was me. I mean, that's where I was at, and I will say that I went through a little bit of an intellectual education between that point and graduation, so that when I graduated in May of 2005, I was not as gung-ho. I did start to have doubts because I was always, on top of all that like toxic masculinity that I'm describing, there was always a separate side of me that would hide away in like the back of my grandparents' bungalow and read books all day, you know, and like hide that part of myself because it wasn't cool on like with my friends. That side was still there. And so I was starting to read, and believe it or not, during my senior year, Colonel Ty Sedgley, who was a lieutenant colonel history instructor at the time, assigned us in a colloquium class, advanced like history majors, Andrew Bacevich's The New American Militarism, 2004, I think it published. And this was the spring of 2005 before I graduated. So
anti-war book. Yeah.
Super anti-war book. It shocked my conscience. And if he hadn't been a West Point graduate himself, Bacevich, and if he hadn't been in Vietnam, I would have dismissed this book as liberal garbage. But because he had, it really shocked me and made me think. And so that was just one example. So by the time I graduated, I was still probably pro-war, but skeptical of the outcomes and whether we could win. And so, so that's kind of how I entered the real Army and Iraq a year later. But that's just an idea of where I was at, sort of the conflicted self.